An Undeceptions podcast.
There are those who claim that your ministry is intolerant and may even threaten the freedom of others.
Freedom is fragile and costly and must be defended by work and by faith, and even by blood.
Now, your ministry reaches more people than the evening news, and I need you to get up there and announce that you fully support this bill.
I cannot water down the gospel to advance anybody's political agenda.
All this talk of persecution, it's gonna die, and who's gonna be left standing? You are!
You cannot legislate the power of God.
He's not on board.
Mr. Luther, do you mind if we get a picture with my daughter?
Well, that was the trailer for the 2014 Christian cinematic thriller Persecuted, starring James Remar as embattled pastor John Luther. In a nutshell, Luther opposes a piece of legislation that would make it illegal for Christians to claim that what they believe is the whole and only truth. In an effort to silence him, an American senator frames Luther for rape and murder. Of course, you'll have to watch the film to discover what happens next. Or don't. Persecuted was panned by the critics, and on the review aggregate website Rotten Tomatoes, which Buff is on all the time, it has an approval rating of 0. Here's a scathing review from the New York Times delivered by Undeceptions in-house film critic, director Mark.
This terrible attempt at a political thriller for the religious right is aimed not at Christians in general, but at a certain breed of them, the kind who feel as if the rest of the world were engaged in a giant conspiracy against their interpretation of good and truth.
Just in that short quote, we've landed in the middle of the culture wars. In parts of the West, yes, the United States, but also my home country of Australia, some Christians use the term persecuted as a rallying cry to fight for rights. Part of the problem is a definitional one. The word persecution can be manipulative, misleading, inflammatory. But that doesn't mean persecution isn't real and doesn't exist. The Oxford English Dictionary, the only standard Undeceptions uses, producer Kaley, defines persecution as, quote, oppression, especially on the grounds of religious faith, political belief, race, etc., the action of pursuing or persecuting a person or group with hostile intent. Just for the record, the earliest occurrence of the word in English was from 1350, so it's a really good old one. The word is from the Latin persecutio, to chase or pursue, to cause harm, which is the exact equivalent of the Greek word in the New Testament, dioko, to pursue or chase, often with the sense of chasing to injure someone. That's persecution, to pursue in order to harm. A random outburst at someone who happens to be a Christian isn't persecution. The word implies both intention and decisiveness on the part of the persecutor. But to count as persecution, there also has to be the fact, or at least potential, of harm to the persecuted. That's why, say, an atheist club that meets together to say mean things about Christians isn't really persecuting Christians. So I'm going to go out on a limb and give my own considered definition of persecution. I put it together at the very end of preparing this episode. Christian persecution is sustained or decisive action by those with the power to cause harm aimed at injuring Christians, legally, physically, or socially, because of their identity or practices. At the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, so that's Matthew 5, Jesus told his students, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you," that's dioko again, "and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad," he says. Here, the sense is broad. It's not quite hunting down to kill, but nor is it a simple criticism either. In Acts chapter 8, though, we're told that a persecution broke out against the church, and here the word does refer to arresting and, in some cases, killing Christians. Because the word is flexible, sometimes Christians today throw the word around merely to refer to any kind of pressure they might be feeling in the world. It's true that there are some troubling headwinds for Christianity in the West. Secularism continues to flex its muscles. And as a result, some Christians who've had a lot of power and privilege for centuries can feel pretty put out. Things that make us feel uncomfortable are sometimes interpreted as persecution. Confession time. When I was a new Christian in my teens, I frequently prayed and read my Bible kneeling by my bed when I should have been out and about doing jobs around the house. And I remember one Saturday morning, my mum, who wasn't a Christian at the time, burst into my room when I was meant to be out raking the leaves. And there I was, praying and reading earnestly. She yelled at me and stormed out of the room. And I remember thinking, it's just like Jesus said, I'm being persecuted. No, this wasn't persecution. It wasn't sustained or decisive action aimed at injuring Christians legally, physically, or socially because of their identity or practices. That was a persecution complex on my part. And there's a corporate version of the same thing that can infect the church as a whole, where every slight, every criticism, every disagreement is seen through the prism of ancient persecution. And one terrible effect of the persecution complex, as you might call it, is that it takes the Western church's eyes off the real persecution that's going on in other parts of the world. And it does the same for wider society. Because the Western church sometimes cries wolf or persecution, the watching world thinks it's totally implausible that any Christians anywhere in the world are suffering real persecution. Christianity is the bully religion. Everyone knows that. There can't be Christians who are arrested, tortured, and killed simply for being Christian. Well, in this episode, we're going to take a look back at what persecution looked like in the early church, what Jesus taught about persecution, and what persecution looks like in the world today, and why every Christian today should give up the persecution complex. I'm John Dickson, and this is Undeceptions. This season of Undeceptions is sponsored by Zondervan Academic. You can get discounts on their special Master Lectures video courses and free chapters of many of the books we talk about here on the pod. Just go to zondervanacademic.com/Undeceptions. Every episode of Undeceptions, we explore some aspect of life, faith, history, science, culture, or ethics that's either much misunderstood or mostly forgotten. With the help of people who know what they're talking about, we're trying to undeceive ourselves and let the truth out.
So, Myth of Persecution, I wrote when I taught at the University of Notre Dame, which, as you know, is like a very Catholic institution. And it was written during the Obama years. And at the time, I was hearing a lot from sort of my fellow Catholics at Notre Dame about how Christians were under attack in the United States, just like they always had been since the beginning of the early church. From the apostles onwards, people have always and everywhere persecuted Christians just for being Christians. Jesus prophesied this, and this has been a continual issue ever since. And oh my word, Christianity could not have succeeded against the odds were it not true. And I would think, well, hang on a sec. I have a few questions. The first is that, it doesn't seem that Christianity has been constantly persecuted, even though I too heard that in Sunday school. And I'm not really convinced that Christians are under attack in modern America, but there's a lot going on in this complex, this idea that Christians are persecuted by definition, always. And as a historian, I wanted to say...
That's Professor Candida Moss, who now works at the University of Birmingham as a professor of theology. She's talking on the Myth Vision podcast about her 2013 book, The Myth of Persecution, subtitled How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom. What she's talking about is what I too have heard a fair bit of in my time. In some quarters of Christianity, there is a tendency to exaggerate the persecution of the early Christians. In the minds of some people, persecution in the Roman Empire was relentless, 300 years of hatred and so on. At times, this victim mentality has been used to help Christians today cope in a world that increasingly doesn't believe. Now, personally, I think the victim mentality is a terrible way to cope. Moss says she's trying to correct that view. Fair enough. But in doing so, she swings too hard the other way. She minimises very clear historical evidence in early Christianity for persecution. Her book made a pretty big splash at the time, and still does. I have people asking me about it all the time. But it was ultimately clickbaity. The historical reviewers were not nearly as positive as the popular media were. Professor Moss knows full well that while Christians weren't routinely persecuted by the Romans, and in fact no historian actually says that, we have pretty good evidence that Christians were formally repressed on several occasions in that early period, and that experience left an indelible mark on Christian consciousness. Well, my first guest today is one of the most respected historians of this particular period, late Roman antiquity, roughly AD 200 to 500. If you want someone to talk about early Christian persecution without exaggeration or minimization, she's the one you want. Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks for doing this.
Now, do I call you Beth?
Of course, everybody does.
Really? I just think with such a glorious... That's Elizabeth de Palma de Geza, Professor of Roman History and Late Antiquity at the University of California in Santa Barbara. This is the first of 2 episodes we have with Beth. Next year, we've got one slated on the great Christian philosopher of the 3rd and 4th century, Lactantius. Beth is an expert on his life. For this episode, though, she's focusing on Rome in the 3rd century, a period that saw the first widespread state-sanctioned persecution of Christianity. Her book on the subject is called A Threat to Public Piety: Christians, Platonists, and the Great Persecution. It's amazing. Before we get to the 3rd century, though, we're going to take a brief look at what persecution looked like for the very earliest Christians in the first 2 centuries after the death and resurrection of Jesus.
To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude were convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer, or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. Tacitus, Annals.
That was the great Roman biographer Tacitus, writing at the dawn of the 2nd century about Emperor Nero's killing of many Christians, it seems, in AD 64. It's the first example of a state repression of Christians. The rumour Nero was trying to quell was that he was personally responsible for the Great Fire of Rome, which destroyed huge portions of the city. Lots of people thought he had ordered it so he could do some rebuilding, which he did end up doing. But he chose to blame the Christians. But as Tacitus reports, no one really believed that the Christians had started the fire. In any case, this persecution, and it does deserve the title, I think, was targeted and brutal, but it wasn't widespread. After 50 years, though, there was another outbreak.
There are two pretty severe persecutions that we have very good evidence for. One in Bithynia at the dawn of the 2nd century,
Yes.
where Pliny the Younger, the governor of that region, gives us excellent evidence in his own letter of, and the way he talks of it is there are so many people he's having to arrest and kill and send off to Rome. He's starting to feel bad about it.
Yeah.
And then the other one in the 250s, Decius and Valerian. Okay, so my question to you is, can you say something about the Pliny persecution? What do we know of it?
Yeah.
What was his problem with Christians?
Yeah. So Pliny, we know about this in great detail because he writes to the Emperor Trajan. Pliny's serving as governor in Bithynia, and it's come to his attention. He's there actually not to deal with Christians at all. He doesn't know about Christians, really. He's come there because the accounts are out of whack, and he's really there to audit the records. So it's come to his attention that there are a group of people who call themselves Christians who aren't participating in the proper rituals probably to the emperor. And what exactly that is, we don't know. Maybe these are citizens and they're supposed to perform sacrificial rituals, maybe burning incense before coming in front of a Roman authority or something like that. So he writes to Trajan because he doesn't know what to do.
It is my practice, my lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offences it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent. And I have been not a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age, or no difference between the very young and the more mature. Whether pardon is to be granted for repentance, or, if a man has once been a Christian, it does him no good to have ceased to be one. Whether the name itself, even without offences, or only the offences associated with the name, are to be punished.
Pliny explains in his letter that he's executing so many Christians, he's worried it might not be the right thing to do, or perhaps he's not following the correct Roman procedure. He says he interrogated those who were denounced as Christians, and those who persisted in saying that they were Christians, he executed, unless they were Roman citizens, in which case they were sent to Rome. He goes on to say that the accusations spread. He wrote, "A great many individuals of every age and class, both men and women, are being brought to trial."
For the moment, this is the line I have taken with all persons brought before me on the charge of being Christians. I have asked them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time, with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. For whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. This made me decide that it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women, whom they call deaconesses. I found nothing but a degenerate sort of cult carried to extravagant lengths. Pliny to Trajan, AD 112.
So this is really the first glimmer of what you could call, it's persecution in the sense that it's coming from a Roman authority. He's certainly not going door to door and rooting people out. This has come to his attention.
People were trying to make that happen, though, weren't they? Publishing pamphlets with the names of Christians.
Right, that's right.
Demetrius at number 3 is a Christian.
Right, that's right. And so he's sensitive to that. So he doesn't, and in
fact,
he
is quite a just man, I think. He's a gentleman, a Roman gentleman.
He is. And Trajan is for his part too, because Trajan says, by no means are you to hunt people down. So it's not to go any further. If somebody comes to your attention through the proper channels, then this is the proper way to deal with them. The complaint against them is mostly because of superstition, of excess religiosity, not in the good Roman way. There's some concern probably for disrespect of Roman imperial authority, I would guess. But this is one of the first incidents that we know of. It's very well recorded. It's clear that it was specifically, but because they were Christian.
We also have Emperor Trajan's letter back to Pliny, telling Pliny to carry on killing Christians so long as Pliny doesn't go around pursuing anonymous tip-offs about the Christians. That would be un-Roman. Fast forward about 100 years to around AD 215, and we have an open letter from the lawyer and theologian Tertullian to Scapula, the proconsul of Carthage, a Roman province in North Africa. Tertullian refers to the torture and execution of ordinary believers, and he boldly says to the governor,
"We are not in any great perturbation or alarm about the persecutions we suffer from the ignorance of men, for we have attached ourselves to this sect, fully accepting the terms of its covenant. For our religion commands us to love even our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. It is peculiar to Christians alone to love those that hate them."
Tertullian goes on to mention what might be the first reference to mass Christian nonviolent action. He threatens a mass turnout of Christians in Carthage before the governor, and he makes clear that Scapula will have to kill thousands of Christians if he wants to put down Christianity. The persecution of Christians in Carthage seems to end with the end of Scapula's rule. Fast forward another 40 years or so, and we find ourselves in the middle of the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperor Decius comes into power in AD 249. He's one of the 20 or so emperors in that 50-year period.
So Decius comes into power and things are a mess. And we know things are a mess because we have letters from, for example, Cyprian in Carthage saying that whenever there's famine, the Romans are saying to the lions, and Tertullian even earlier says something similar. And I think a good Roman emperor looking around his domain, there's been plague. As a result, there's been famine, there's invasion, there's been civil war. Might well think that he'd lost the trust of the gods, right? And so what he calls for is a supplicatio. And I wouldn't call this a persecution per se, because the supplicatio demands a ritual performance from all Romans. And it's a traditional ritual where you are supposed to have a sacrifice that supplicates the gods on the behalf of the state. And it's done in times of emergency. He does mandate, however, that you need a receipt. So everyone is supposed to go to the local authority, burn some incense, or pour a libation that will show that you've performed the proper act of supplication.
We found a couple of these receipts too, haven't we, in the Oxyrhynchus papyri?
Yes, there are a number of libelli, papyrus sheets that record so-and-so did this on such and such a date. And
an eyewitness did it, and second witness, and it's pretty serious stuff.
In great Roman legal practice.
A supplicatio, by the way, was a public prayer or thanksgiving to the Roman gods. It's where we get the term supplication, of course. And yes, This is the same Oxyrhynchus collection from which the first hymn comes. As I think I've said before, the Oxyrhynchus collection is the most significant ancient literary find in the history of archaeology, due to the sheer breadth of insight it's given us about the everyday lives of those in Roman Egypt. Quite a number of these supplicatio receipts have been discovered from the time of Decius, bits of them anyway. They're often called libellos, a type of certificate that declared participation in sacrifice to the gods. Here's one of them found in Oxyrhynchus that's actually got a date on it, the year 250.
To those chosen to be over the sacrifices of the Oxyrhynchite city, from Aurelius Guion, son of Ammonius, his mother being Tius. Always, of course, to sacrifice and pour the libation and revere the gods having been my custom, in accordance with what was ordered by the divine judgment. Now too, in front of you, I am sacrificing and pouring the libation. I have tasted of the offerings, along with Taus my wife, and Ammonius and Ammonianus my sons, and daughter Thecla. And I ask you to certify this for me below. Year 1 of the Imperator, Caesar Gaius Messius Quintus Traianus Decius Pius Felix Augustus. I, Aurelius Guion, have handed it in. I, Aurelius Serapion, who is also known as Caremon, wrote for him, due to his not knowing letters.
Yeah, so, many people did this, but there were certainly a number of conscientious objectors, and the ones we know about were Christian. Yeah. I wouldn't assume that all of the people who objected were Christian. There could well have been others.
Well, parenthetically, Jews didn't have to do this, right?
No, Jews were... Can
you just explain to my audience why?
Would have been excused. Well, Jews traditionally had special dispensation. They were obliged to pray for the emperor's well-being, but from the time that Judea came into the empire, during the time of Pompey and Caesar, in order to sort of make that a smooth process, those two figures guaranteed Jews the right of religious tolerance. Romans didn't particularly like Judaism. And now and then Jews got in trouble, certainly during the First Jewish War and other skirmishes in the 2nd century. But they had official tolerance. And so they would not have been subject to this particular edict in the early 250s.
Emperor Decius's edict requiring inhabitants of the Roman Empire to sacrifice to the gods is the first empire-wide repression of Christians. Up until Decius, persecution had been localised and ad hoc. This was different. It's definitely pursuing Christians, and maybe others, with hostile intent and on an imperial scale. Those who refused to sacrifice were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. In 251, Emperor Decius dies in battle, and the demand for sacrifices to the Roman gods ends. But 2 years later, Emperor Valerian comes to power and renews this Christian persecution with vigour.
And is Valerian just carrying on the Decius
Would that we knew.
Yeah, right.
So our source for most of this is Eusebius's Church History, which is written early in the 4th century from his post in Caesarea, where he had a great library. Yeah. And a lot of documentation. It's very clear what Decius was doing. It's much less clear what Valerian was doing. Valerian comes into power in a few years after Decius. So it's not clear whether he's continuing it or he's starting something new. Eusebius says that Valerian was encouraged to persecute because of the machinations of this kind of pagan priest that he was working with. So Eusebius seems to make a distinction between the two.
He lists a lot of names of
yes.
individuals
yes.
who were executed.
Yes.
Not all of them great bishops or anything like that, but some of them just lowly Christians, but he has names. Mm-hmm. Do you take that seriously? I mean, do you think he's got documentation there?
I think that for the eastern part of the empire and anything that's on a document that Eusebius has, I think he's fairly reliable. He does, however, like to chop up his documents. And so in the places where he interjects his own point of view, I don't know if I would trust him 100% there. He's almost totally ignorant about events in the West. And he's totally reliant on just a handful of things that he's got in his library.
Just a note for the producer who's now listening to this recording, we will read that section from Eusebius where he lists all the names. Yeah, it's quite compelling.
In his Ecclesiastical History 813, Eusebius lists the following martyred bishops and priests. At Nicomedia, Antimos, the bishop of Nicomedia, is beheaded. Lucianos, a presbyter of Antioch, offers a brave confession and is martyred. In Phoenicia, Tyrannian, bishop of Tyre, Zenobius, presbyter of Sidon, Silvanus, bishop of Emesa, with others. In Antioch, the bishop of Antioch is thrown to the sea. Zenobius, a physician, is tortured and martyred. In Palestine, Silvanus, bishop of Gaza, is beheaded with 39 others at the copper mines of Pheno. Peleus and Nelos, Egyptian bishops and companions, are burnt at the same mines. The presbyter, Pamphilus, pride of the church of Caesarea, is martyred. Eusebius states that he will write about him separately. In Alexandria in Egypt, Petrus, bishop of Alexandria, with the presbyters Faustus, Dius, and Ammonius. Philius, Heschius, Pachimius, and Theodorus.
It goes on and on, but you get the point. Not just bishops, but common lay Christians were also killed. The Decius and Valerian persecutions lasted on and off for about 10 years. After Valerian was killed in 260, his successors cancelled the orders against Christians. Believers could once again own property, meet openly, and serve in public roles. So Christians carried on their lives and their mission, though perhaps nervously worried about what might come next. And what came next was their worst nightmare. It's not called the Great Persecution for nothing. That's after the break. This episode of Undeceptions is sponsored by Zondervan Academic, and I wanted to tell you about one of their new books, Prophet, Priest and King, edited by respected scholars Michael Horton, Elizabeth Mumburu and Justin Holcomb. You've no doubt heard the way that Christianity is sometimes dismissed as a Western, even a white man's religion. But that's just not true. From its beginnings in the Middle East, then through Africa, Asia and Latin America today, Christianity is very often non-white. It is a profoundly global movement. Prophet, Priest and King demonstrates this beautifully. The book gathers the work of majority world theologians, looking at Jesus through three ancient roles: the prophet, the priest and the king. What's fascinating is how each culture sees something fresh, sometimes things we in the West have completely overlooked. Seeing Jesus through the eyes of someone from an entirely different culture from our own really helps us round out the picture of who Jesus really is. Billions of people across cultures find Jesus compelling. And while plenty of people see Christianity as hopelessly divided, this book helps point out the unified testimony of the global church about the central figure of Christianity. You can find Prophet, Priest and King on Amazon, and you can get a sample chapter of the book at zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions. zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions.
Can you set the context for the Roman Empire in the crazy 200s AD? Because lots of things have happened that are very different from the Augustan period.
Absolutely, yes.
Citizenship, the breaking up of the territories and so on. Can you tell us what we need to know about the 200s?
Yeah, it's a time of real contrasts. So on the one hand, early in the century, you have an effort by the Severan dynasty, so Septimius Severus and his descendants. Their jurists, their legal scholars, made an effort to produce some legal uniformity in the empire. So making everybody citizens in 218, the Emperor Caracalla. They also employed these really talented jurists, guys like Ulpian and Papinian, who helped them collect edicts from all over the empire, pull them back to Rome, produce legal textbooks, standardize everything, send it back out to the provinces, so that this was the first time that everybody had been under the same system of law. So,
and this was because Caracalla made everyone citizens,
yes,
allowed everyone to be citizens?
Yes. So there's a real push to uniformity. And in the Roman world, the emperor is also Pontifex Maximus, and so is responsible for the correct exercise of religion. So in this legal uniformity and political uniformity, there's the expectation, of course, of religious uniformity.
In the preamble to his famous edict, Caracalla thanks the immortal gods for saving him from danger. He declares that it is an act of piety to lead foreigners into the temples of the Roman gods. And then he announces that all free inhabitants of the empire are henceforth Roman citizens, to be included in this divinely ordered empire. Details of the decree are in the show notes. This era of turmoil from 235 to 284 is known as the crisis of the 3rd century. By the early 200s, the empire stretched from North Africa through Europe and deep into the Middle East. With endless frontier raids and a vast population to govern, it was almost unmanageable even in good times. Add plague, invasions, and the crushing costs of the army, and the system was in near collapse. When Severus Alexander was murdered by his own troops in 235, chaos followed. In the next 50 years, Rome cycled through about 20 emperors, whereas they'd only had about 25 emperors in the previous 250 years. It was a mess. Not until Diocletian in 284 did stability begin to return.
This sort of brings us up to the great reforming Emperor Diocletian.
Right.
How did he try and take Rome by the throat and reorganize it?
So he came into power after a couple of emperors had started to gain control of the frontiers. So Aurelian in 270 had managed to reintegrate the empire, and by the time Diocletian seizes the throne really in 284, Persia has more or less been subdued and the Germans are more or less quiescent. But he kind of takes his cue from the divided empire of the mid-century and realizes that an imperial presence needs to be extended throughout the empire in a way that one emperor could no longer do. And so he divides the Mediterranean world into 4 quadrants. And over the first few years of his reign, he sets one man in each quadrant. He shares supreme power with his friend Maximian, gives Maximian the west, Diocletian takes the east, and then each of them takes a junior subordinate. Maximian divides the west with Constantius, and Diocletian divides the east with Galerius.
And it's weird for people who don't know this history to think that junior one is called Caesar.
Yes.
And when
yes.
we all sort of grew up thinking Caesar is
yes,
like the ultimate.
That's right.
So you've got an Augustus,
yes,
east and west,
yeah,
and a Caesar, east and west.
Yeah.
Was it really just as simple as the empire was too big? That's why you needed sort of 4 leaders over it? Or was there something else going on?
Well, in these days, it was really important. The position of emperor itself is, we think of this role as all supreme and people naturally obeying. And yet, if you've come out of a period where you have 20 emperors and 30 years, according power and authority to this individual isn't necessarily a given. So it was really important for the troops to have the imperial presence along the frontier. And there was still action enough at the frontier that having somebody that represented imperial authority there was important for not just making sure that there was order, but also being able to have the authority to command the troops, to gather resources for taxation, to establish the relationships within the provinces that would make sure that the army was well supplied, but also to have the kind of interactions with provincials that would then over time solidify imperial control again. And that would mean things like refurbishing roads or building warehouses, the kinds of day-to-day things that people in the provinces hadn't had from the emperors for such a long time.
And Diocletian really does bring a kind of stability,
doesn't
absolutely.
It?
Because you go from 20 emperors in 20 years to a 20-year reign.
Exactly right.
In his case.
So Emperor Diocletian brought stability back into the Roman Empire, but he also instigated the cruelest and most systematic persecution of Christians ever in the ancient world. Christianity was growing in the empire, and Christians were rising up the ranks of power in Roman politics, in the academy, and in the army even. But the big thinkers of the day just weren't happy with the infiltration of Christians and Christian ideas into Roman society. So something had to be done.
These philosophers who are charged, right, with advising the sovereign managed to finagle their way into influence at Diocletian's court, probably through his Caesar Galerius, and through some oracular priests and making an impression on the emperor that way. So, as we know today, it's not uncommon for a group once marginalized that comes into, sort of social acceptability to disturb and disrupt the people who had been the brokers of power before, and to trigger a backlash, right? And so I think that that's what is happening in the court of Diocletian as these philosophers, who are elite, who have traditionally been the great thinkers of the empire, when they start to be troubled, an emperor is going to listen.
The greatest philosopher of this time was Porphyry. He wrote 2 works. One's called Against the Christians, not super subtle, and the other is Philosophy from Oracles.
How can these Christians be thought worthy of forbearance? They have not only turned away from those who from earliest time are referred to as divine among all Greeks and barbarians, and by emperors, lawgivers, and philosophers, all of a common mind, but also in choosing impieties and atheism, they have preferred their fellow creatures. And to what sort of penalties might they not justly be subjected, these people who are fugitives from the traditions of their fathers?
Pressure was growing on Christians, and by the year 303, things reached a boiling point.
And then in February 303, Diocletian makes a decree. Well, several decrees over several months, right? Can you tell us what those decrees were?
Yeah, so the decree is a cluster of things. Number 1, all Christians lose their status. So remember, everybody was now a citizen. Well, not if you were a Christian. If you had senatorial status, you were now of the status of the most ordinary person, subject to capital punishment. If you were an imperial freed person, you became enslaved again. All of the rights and privileges that would have accorded a citizen of any standing was lost to you. So in a modern analogy would be that you became undocumented. Right, in one fell swoop. The second provision of the edict was that Christian places of assembly were to be demolished. A Christian scripture was to be burned.
That's an interesting one. They'd worked out that those scriptures were part of the problem, right?
Yes.
They've got books. Let's get rid of their books.
Yep. So book burning.
Christians didn't invent that? I thought that was Christians who invented that.
No, they came later. So that was the primary thrust of the first edict. After that, then later on, they apprehended bishops and other leaders of the clergy. And then they tried to institute universal sacrifice, and those were the primary provisions of the edicts.
So I'm interested. I've never really known, how did they manage this with their police, going door to door? I mean, we actually have some echoes of transcripts of people going to door to door, but how do they manage it? I mean, did everyone have to come down on a certain day and do a sacrifice? Was your name on a roll and you got ticked off? I'm just trying to understand it.
So it would have been, you don't have totalitarian government in the Roman Empire. It would have been very sort of like a network of things. So we know in great detail what happened in Nicomedia, for example, where the emperor was. Lactantius, in fact, tells us. So Heracles and his men went out and went to the church, which everybody could see on the hill, with his troops and accountants. They break down the doors, they enter the sanctuary, they take out all the treasure, they box it up. There's an accountant keeping tabs of how much it is as they box it up. They take all of the documents, they make a bonfire, and then they demolish the building.
We actually have a transcript from one of these interviews in Kirta in North Africa.
The transcript is dated to within months of the first edict. It's actually got the date 19th of May, 303. The Roman guardian of the city, the so-called permanent priest and curator, was Munatius Felix. He was tasked with investigating church leaders and property in the region. In the record, he interviews several church leaders, including Paul the bishop and various others, deacons and readers, people charged with reading the Bible in church. He's particularly interested in codices. That's the codex or Christian book where the scriptures were written down, not in the long scroll form, but in the kind of page form with a cover that we now think of as a book. Anyway, these were to be gathered up and destroyed. Two deacons, Marcaclius and Catilinus, refuse to play along. They hand over just one book and advise that the other books are with various other members of the church somewhere else in the city. And Felix isn't impressed. The official transcript reads,
Felix, the permanent priest and curator, said, "Why have you given only one codex?" Catilinus and Marcaclius said, "We have no more, as we are subdeacons, but the readers have the codices." Felix said, "Show me the readers." Marcaclius and Catilinus said, "We don't know where they live."
That is surely a little white lie.
Felix said to Catilinus and Marcaclius, "If you do not know where they live, tell me their names." Catilinus and Marcaclius said, "We are not traitors. Here we are. Have us killed." Felix said, "Let them be taken into custody."
That is the last we hear of brave Catilinus and Marcaclius. It was probably the last anyone heard of them.
So how it's enforced at that aspect depends on the willingness of the emperor of the region and the praetorian prefect and the military to accomplish it. So the people in the east were pretty zealous, and in the cities in the east, it's very clear that this happened city
and there
by
are more
city.
Christians there in the east too, right?
But even in Constantius's domains in the northwest, it's quite likely that, and well, we know that from Lactantius as well, that he demolished churches. And so that means that he probably sent the praetorian prefect, say, to the city of Lyon or the city of Autun to do something very similar. In terms of we don't have libelli for this as we do for Decius's persecution. What we do know is that other Romans could take advantage of the Christians' diminished standing to lay claim to their property or to bring them into a court of law. And these Christians who were attacked through the judicial process that way would have had no recourse. They also would have been obliged to sacrifice in front of the emperor, and so they may or may not have chosen to do that. But we don't We don't know of authorities going door to door in this. You also have, and we know this from Eusebius, you also have people who kind of throw themselves at the Roman authorities, which they were not supposed to do, but did anyway. There's a very famous example of somebody who did exactly this when the Edict of Persecution was being posted in Nicomedia, and he tears it down in front of everybody, and he says, "Oh, it's just a notice about the defeating of some Goths and Sarmatians," and he's apprehended and executed and burned at the stake. So,
yikes!
Yikes, indeed. If you're keeping score, the edicts of Emperor Diocletian are as follows. Churches demolished. Scriptures destroyed. Christians forbidden to assemble. Freed slaves who were Christians were re-enslaved. Believers in elite society, including in academic posts, were to lose their positions and social rank. When this didn't seem to work, a law mandated that every citizen should participate in sacrifices to the traditional Greek and Roman gods. Anyone who refused, as Christians believed they had to, was to be tortured until they relented, or else they were executed. Interestingly, Diocletian abdicated in 305, and Galerius took over, continuing the persecution for another 6 years. But then, Galerius gets sick, and on his deathbed, he issues a decree of toleration in 311. It's not exactly religious freedom that he pronounces, but it's an everyone get back to your corners kind of call. He even asks Christians in this decree to pray for his health. He must have been desperate. Now, I don't know if Christians did pray for him. I like to think they did, but he died just months later. And you guessed it, his successor, Maximinus Dia, had no qualms continuing the persecution in the East. The years 303 to 312 were very difficult years for Christians. It's why historians still call it the Great Persecution. But at the end of the year 312, it all suddenly ended. This is when Emperor Constantine came to power, and to everyone's amazement, he converted to the Christian faith. The Emperor of Rome was suddenly not the great persecutor of Christians. He was a Christian. You'll have to listen to our full episode on Constantine if you want to hear more about that, because it's really complicated. Just wind back to episode 61. It's titled, unimaginatively, Emperor Constantine. It's with Alana Nobbs and Doug Lee, two world-renowned experts on the topic. It's one of my favourites. There is so much to undeceive concerning Constantine. For now, though, the conversion of Constantine gave the church its first taste of privilege, setting the stage centuries later for the vast global superpower known as Christendom, the domain of Christ. Now, this point can sometimes be exaggerated. It was Emperor Theodosius in the 390s, not Constantine back in the 330s, who actually outlawed pagan religion and permitted only Christianity, and Judaism, by the way. We should really do an episode on Theodosius. Producer Kaley, can you mark that down, please? Theodosius was a mass of contradictions. He's a great guy, and he's a bully. And even Theodosius can't really be blamed for Christendom. Remember, the Roman Empire in the West collapsed a century after Theodosius, so there wasn't anyone to impose Christian rule on in those lands of Europe until Charlemagne, around the year 800. So that's ages later. That's when you really have Christendom. And Charlemagne absolutely, positively deserves an episode. Producer Kaley, you mark that down? Anyway, back to my point. In the West today, the vestiges of Christendom, the political rule of Christ, are still evident. And some Christians in the West can feel quite uncomfortable watching those privileges they've had for about 1,000 years eroded by waves of secularism. They sometimes cry, persecution, when it's just a kind of balancing of privileges. But here's the thing. the privileges of the Western Church: land, wealth, tax breaks, access to government, and so on, make it really difficult to talk about the genuine persecution of Christians, which really is happening in some parts of the world. The Church's reputation in the West as powerful makes it difficult for some to imagine that a number of Christians today live in precarious circumstances. After the break, persecution, real persecution today. Most of us picture Bali as beaches and sunshine. Oh, so many Aussies go there. But away from the resorts, many families struggle to provide even the basics for their children. And that's why I'm so encouraged by Anglican Aid's Project Bali. They're caring for more than 300 kids who can't live at home. They give them food, medical care, education, and Christian community. One 14-year-old boy named Gara said, "I now have the opportunity to study, to play, and to dream again." And you can help more children just like Gara by visiting anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions. That's anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions to make a tax-deductible gift today. Please help these guys out.
Suddenly, I felt like somebody grabbed my arm and says, "My son, leave your home right now." You can imagine if you have a 1 or 2 minutes to leave home, what you can take with you. So I ran away from my home. That was one of the hardest nights in my life, leaving everything behind.
That's Haroon, talking with director Mark from Germany. Haroon isn't his real name. It's too dangerous to reveal his identity, even now, living thousands of miles away from his original home.
I grew up in Pakistan in very radical Sunni Muslim family. My grandfather, my father, they were imam in Pakistan. My older sister, she had a master in Islamic education, and she was also a teacher in Islamic school in Pakistan for women. And I was very committed from childhood. When my family, they sent me into Islamic school, which is very famous Islamic school in Pakistan. And they take kids after 5th grade. And I went to that Islamic school to memorize Quran. They was very proud in my whole tribe. Like they was honored in my tribe as well, that our son is going to become imam and he's becoming hafiz, like the person who will memorize Quran. So I was faithful to my calling in Islam, and my principal, my leader, he decided to send me to Europe in 2005 in Greece, Athens, for continuing Islamic mission and spreading Islam in Europe.
Haroon was sent to Greece to help plant a mosque in Athens. To be able to stay in Greece, Haroon had to get a job to support himself and find a place to live. He found a job working for a Christian couple who also offered him a place to live. Haroon had been taught to hate Christians, but the couple he lived with were kind to him. The difference between what he'd been taught and what he saw right in front of him caused him to doubt lots of what he'd heard about Christians and about Christianity. If you're a Plus subscriber, you're about to get the full story. If not, and, there's no judgment, no worries, we're just going to pick up at the relevant point. Haroon eventually gave up his mosque duties in Athens. He turned away from Islam itself, and he embraced Christ as the true Lord. Amazingly, he then decided to go back to Pakistan.
It was so difficult for me to tell my family or any friend that I am I'm a follower of Jesus. I went back to Pakistan after resigning my ministry. I said, I want to back to Pakistan. Some other imam came and they took over. And that mosque still going on. And I went back to Pakistan. And my father said, okay, welcome back home. I have a mosque and you can be imam. And I became imam in Pakistan, leading hundreds of people every 5 times a day. And then leading Friday prayer, one of the biggest prayer in a week. Then my father, he has arranged marriage for me. I could not say no to him. Still nobody know that I am follower of Jesus. But I went to a church in Pakistan and I talked to pastor there. I said, and this pastor knew me that how radical I was and I am, and how much difficult I create for Christian people. And I said, this is a dream I have about Jesus and I need Bible. What can I do now? And he said, Imam, thank you for having dream, but please don't come to our church. Because if anybody knew that you start coming to our church and you became Christian, they will kill all of us. So please don't come to our church.
Christians are less than 2% of Pakistan's population, mostly poor, low-caste Hindu converts. Converting from Islam is possible, but it's dangerous. Pakistan has some of the world's toughest blasphemy laws. Insult the Prophet, and you're not just an idiot, you risk prison or worse. Many accused never make it to trial. They're cut down by mobs. When Haroon left Islam, the danger was immediate for him and those near him. He couldn't risk attending an official public church. Instead, he slipped quietly into an underground fellowship of Muslim background believers.
Sometimes we open Quran and talk about Jesus, and people can see that we are talking about Quran and Hadith and Muhammad, but we talk about Jesus. But long story short is, my family, they found me in my mega church after some month, and they took me home with my followers, and they start asking questions. Okay, you believe that Jesus is Son of God and He's God. I said, I don't know He's God or not, but I know one thing. I was sinner and He is my Savior. And then after that, everybody started beating me. There was like around 20 to 25 people. And this is the first one in my life is here and here. They broke my both arms, both legs, both multiple ribs was broken. And I still remember that they throw me in a gutter, in the mud, where the water come from toilet. And some people, they open my mouth and they pee in my mouth. That I said that Jesus is my God and my Savior. Some people, they took me to hospital. It was very hard in Pakistan. Many months I couldn't move, I couldn't go anywhere. And some Christian people in Pakistan, they took big risk and they took me their home. And I was thrown out of my home with broken legs and arms and ribs. And then some month later, my friend, he called me and he said, Haroon, come back to your home. You have son. God gave me son. So I went back to my home. I was healed after a few months. Then I went back to my home to see my son. Nobody loved me, but I loved to see my son. It was 27 of Ramadan, 2011. I was driving car in the city side. And one young man, he came to my car and he stopped my car. It was the middle of city. Pakistan is crowded everywhere. And he stopped my car and he came out. I came out. And he was just 2 meters far from me, and he had AK-47 Kalashnikov. He had with a jihadist uniform, and he started shouting on me, and hundreds of people stopped there and start watching, and he started cursing on me. He's a murtad, he's infidel, he's this and that. So after he says many things, and after he started shouting Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, he said, your punishment is dead, your punishment beheaded. So he said, Allahu Akbar, and I closed my eyes. I said, it is done. And I don't know how long it took, few seconds or few minutes. I was crying and praying and closed my eyes. And one man from crowd, he came to me and he pushed me and he said, hey man, run, look, his gun is not working. What are you waiting for? And I opened my eyes, I saw that he was drawing and his first bullet was jammed. AK-47 never stopped. During my jihad training, I use AK-47 all the time, never stop. But God stopped his gun, AK-47. I ran away. 4 days later, while I was sleeping in my home with my family, so many doubt, where can I go? What can I do? My best friend, he called me and he said, Haroon, tonight is your last night. I turn off my phone. I start crying and start looking like my son sleeping, wife, my all family, because we have whole family, we live together. So I said, if he did not kill me other day, maybe they are already outside and it is done. Suddenly, I felt like somebody grabbed my arm and says, my son, leave your home right now.
A local Islamic leader issued a fatwa against Haroon. Calls to shoot him on sight appeared in the local newspaper and on the radio. He fled to Germany, where he was taken in as a refugee.
2 things happened, changed my life. The first one was love of Christ, changed my life. That couple in Greece, they was not trying to convert me to Christianity. They was just there to love me. This was just their call to love me. The love of Christ changed my life. Love of Christ became louder than my 5-time pray, don't touch, don't eat, don't drink, this everything. People don't read Bible, they read your life. They read love of Christ in your life.
I hear Haroon's story, and it's hard for me to say that any Christian in the West is persecuted. But my final guest says maybe it's not so simple. Have you got a definition of persecution for us?
We do. We have one as open doors that you have to start somewhere. You have to define those parameters. So the way our research is conducted and over time, 70 years for the ministry, that definition we've settled on is any hostility experienced as a result of one's identification with Christ. So hostility that you experience as a result of following Jesus.
Adam Holland is the CEO of Open Doors Australia, an organisation dedicated to serving and strengthening the persecuted church around the world. They do that by providing training, distributing Bibles and literature in tricky places, offering emergency relief and medical aid where it might be otherwise hard for Christians to get it. And they raise awareness of Christian persecution in parts of the world that don't often hear about it. Honestly, Open Doors is amazing. So are we persecuted in the West, in Australia, in the United States?
I think that there's forms of persecution. So a lot of our research we categorize and squeeze or smash. So smash is violent acts of persecution. Squeeze are those categories that are more subtle and often nuanced. Social pressure, cultural, workplace, even legislative. I think there's an argument that in the West, there's an increase in forms particularly of squeeze persecution.
Give me an example of what you would put in that category.
I think there's a few. I mean, in Australia, I think where there has typically been the connection between a lot of legislative frameworks and Judeo-Christian frameworks, it's unsettling for many Christians as some of that shifts and starts to pull apart. I'm sure you've read, I've heard you reference the book Dominion by Tom Holland, fascinating book. I mean, I think that starts to unpack some of where the power structure being directly connected to the church creates a certain experience of cultural institutions, legislation, even how government operates. And so as that sort of diminishes or unpicks a little bit, I think forms of squeeze persecution where it can feel hostile as a Christian. That there are moments that it feels like that is hostile to the belief I have specifically because I'm a Christian.
Some would see that as just the winding back of centuries of privilege, not in any sense unfair mistreatment.
I think there's times that persecution may be too strong a phrase, but I think there are times that it is persecution because it's hostile towards what is specifically true in following Jesus, what we believe, what we stand for, what we communicate, how we share the gospel.
Tell me about smash persecution. Help my listeners think of, the top forms of smash going on in the world today.
Yeah, I mean, it's sheer violence, John. So in sub-Saharan Africa, that's where we see the greatest increase. So the number of identified deaths. So again, there's areas of conflict often happening, but the research for the World Watch List and Open Doors identifies was the cause of that violence because someone was a Christian, not because wrong place, wrong time. So thousands of deaths in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Nigeria, and it's a vindictive, intense hostility towards Christians where there's no rule of law. So that smash persecution in its most extreme form is violence and a form of murder and death. But burning down a church, burning down someone's home, forcibly removing children from a family, those are all forms of smash.
And where is this happening most in the world right now?
Yeah, I mean, part of Nigeria's the most intense. So I think where there's been particularly Christian regions that for generations have been, but really the whole region. So in North Africa, that's had forms of violent persecution for some period of time, but it's basically extending south. So into places like Burkina Faso, Nigeria, even parts of Kenya. So in the World Watch List, which identifies the top 50, that's where we see the highest increase in smash persecution in that sub-Saharan region.
The World Watch List is Open Doors' annual ranking of the 50 countries where Christians face the most extreme persecution. It's been published now for 33 years. In 2025, the countries where Christians faced the most difficulties were, from 10 to 1, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Nigeria, Eritrea, Sudan, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and at the top of the list, North Korea. Sometimes people who don't believe accuse Christians in the West, I'm in the West for this part of our conversation, accuse Christians of having a persecution complex. Oh, you think the whole world's out to get you. Do you see that? Or is that just a legitimate response to the winding back of Christianity and culture?
I think the reality is it's going one way. I think it's unlikely that our cultural institutions, our legislative frameworks, the way that we operate in a democratic society is going to become more and more integrated with Christian beliefs, that framework of viewing the world. And it can create a complex that is hypersensitive to what feels like persecution. I think that the challenge is, if you look at a spectrum or a continuum of the reality of persecution, I don't think anyone in the US would say we're persecuted as North Koreans are persecuted, or things on the much further end of the spectrum. But that doesn't preclude it being absolutely true. I mean, Open Doors we choose to tread carefully that our focus is on the most persecuted. Invariably questions come up around, well, what does that mean here for me in the West? And, it's a question I ask myself, does persecution play a role in my own discipleship to Jesus? I would say I've been ridiculed. I would say that I've had, I think we both were at Macquarie Uni. I can remember finishing my honours thesis in philosophy and feeling like, I think I got marked down because I built theology into it. Or maybe it was because my arguments weren't as good as they should have been. But is that persecution? It's not hostile, but it's ridiculing. So I think the complex can stem from becoming hypersensitive to what is very light pressures of squeeze persecution.
We've called this episode Persecution Complex for two reasons. Partly because the issue of persecution is complex, but also because Christians are sometimes accused, not unreasonably, of having a persecution complex, thinking the whole world's out to get them. Back in 2017, the organisation International Christian Concern included the United States in its Religious Freedom Hall of Shame. The list was meant to highlight 12 countries where Christians face persecution. The United States was in a list with countries like North Korea, Nigeria, Pakistan, and China. Sounds implausible, but here's part of the report.
Throughout the US, current events and shifting perceptions are causing conflicts between Christian beliefs and public sentiment. This cultural shift affects Christian businesses, organisations, and individuals through legal action, free speech infringement, public expressions of faith, and employment. While there's no comparison between the life of a Christian in the US with persecuted believers overseas, ICC sees these worrying trends as an alarming indication of a decline in religious liberty in the United States.
No comparison indeed. But I find the perception of persecution really interesting. And it's pretty widespread. Around the same time, Barna Research released a study that suggested 52% of American Christians, half of them, felt persecuted because of their faith. Many others used terms like marginalised, 44%, sidelined, 40%, silenced, 38%, afraid to speak up, 31%, and afraid to look stupid, 23%. This is one of the problems with making an episode about persecution when no official definition of persecution really exists. What I think amounts to persecution and what you think amounts to persecution might be quite different. I proposed a definition at the top of the episode. Christian persecution is sustained or decisive action by those with the power to cause harm aimed at injuring Christians, legally, physically, or socially, because of their identity or practices. And I honestly think being made to feel stupid doesn't count. Either way, how are Christians meant to respond? What's the right response for a Christian faced with genuine persecution?
Yes. I mean, I wrestle with this because you spend time with persecuted Christians who are in that extreme end of the spectrum. They've experienced smash, real trauma, or forms of squeeze. And they tend to be joyful, John. I mean, it's not necessarily dour and just sackcloth and ashes. It's, we love our country. God's at work in our life. They want to share the gospel, but it's also a response of prayer to not return evil for evil, to pray for our persecutors. That's what often persecuted Christians will share.
Mm-hmm. Open Doors focuses on strengthening the persecuted church. That's sort of in your mission statement. Why the focus on strengthening rather than, say, stopping persecution?
I guess the deeper answer is we recognize that as long as the kingdom of God is expanding and the gospel is being shared, we're taught, I mean, Jesus teaches us persecution will be part of that. If he was persecuted, we should expect to be persecuted. I've spent time with persecuted Christians, you may have as well, John, where they, in a way, they are thankful for the depth of their discipleship journey that comes from persecution. If that was removed, I mean, I've been asked directly, sharing with a group of persecuted Christians, what does discipleship look like if you're not persecuted? Because that is a foreign concept to them now. How confronting for me of feeling like my honest thesis got a reduction in its marks compared to I'll never own a home, I'll never have a job. So that, I think our persecuted family have a deeper insight to that. And, they wouldn't want persecution, that's the wrong way to put it, but the eradication of persecution just doesn't make sense in a biblical framework, in a gospel sense. And so we seek to strengthen those that experience persecution.
Yeah, there's that wonderful passage that talks about rejoicing that you're persecuted because you're sharing in the sufferings of Christ.
Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. 1 John chapter 4.
I mean, that's the thing that you see in a persecuted Christian, is they feel like they're more in Christ than I feel from day to day.
And an intimacy that comes.
Let's press pause. I've got a 5-minute Jesus for you. One striking thing about the history of Christianity is that the early believers thought that their persecution and even martyrdom was one of the key reasons Christianity was so successful. In the show notes, we'll post a table of the 7 scholarly estimates for the growth of Christianity in the first 3 centuries. They're all trying to calculate the number of Christians by about the year 300. The highest number is 6 million. That's Rodney Stark. That would be 10% of the Roman Empire by the year 300. The lowest estimate is by Bart Ehrman, who thinks about 4% of the empire was Christian, which puts it at around 2.5 million Christians. Now, I don't really mind which one we choose. It's still a really big number. I tend to average all 7 of these great scholars, so that would give us 7.3% of the empire, or 4.4 million Christians by the year 300. That required a growth rate of 30% per decade. It's astonishing. Nothing in antiquity spread like that. Now, there's a bunch of scholarly work trying to figure out why. How did this happen? But there's not a lot of agreement. I got a PhD in this stuff and I can't tell you for sure how Christianity spread so quickly. But I can tell you what the early Christians thought. They thought Christianity spread because of persecution. Here's Tertullian writing in the year 215.
Our religion, however, which you know is growing stronger at the very point when it seems to be cut down, will never perish. For whoever beholds such noble endurance as though struck down by some kind of uneasiness will be driven to inquire what is the matter in question. Then, when he knows the truth, immediately follows the same way.
Or Lactantius in 305, right in the middle of the Great Persecution.
There is a reason why God lets persecution come upon us. It increases the number of God's people, and it is not difficult to show why. Some want to know what that is good, which is defended even unto death, and which is preferred to all the happy precious things there are in this life. And other people standing by hear us, amidst the tortures, say that we do not sacrifice to stones shaped by human hands, but to a living God who is in heaven. Many come to realize this is true, and they take it to heart.
Contrast that with the persecution complex, grumbling at the mean media outlet that said nasty things about what we believe. Think of those who fight for our church rights at the expense of other people's rights. But ancient Christians approached persecution with joy. Joy that they were participating in the way of Jesus Christ himself. And they thought it was key to the growth of Jesus' message. It was the embodiment of their gospel of Jesus' death and resurrection. They welcomed the chance to showcase love of enemy, just as God had loved his enemies in entering the world in Christ and dying for all. Ignatius was the bishop of the churches of Antioch in Syria during the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century, where like 40 years after the Apostle Peter, Ignatius was arrested and ordered to stand trial in Rome for refusing to renounce his Christian faith and sacrifice to the Roman idols. He was eventually executed, likely fed to wildcats in the Colosseum. Now, we have 7 of his letters that he wrote to Christians in various towns along the way as he travelled to Rome for trial. In one of his letters to the persecuted Christians of Ephesus, he wrote,
Pray continually for the rest of humankind as well, that they may find God, for there is in them hope of repentance. Therefore, allow them to be instructed by you, at least by your deeds. In response to their anger, be gentle. In response to their boasts, be humble. In response to their slander, offer prayers. In response to their errors, be steadfast in the faith. In response to their cruelty, be civilized. Do not be eager to imitate them. Let us show, by our forbearance, that we are their brothers and sisters, and let us be eager to be imitators of the Lord.
Now, let's be clear, none of this meant that ancient Christians were timid. Tertullian, at the dawn of the 200s, wrote to the governor of Carthage, Scapula, reminding him there were thousands of Christians in the region and they were willing to stage a mass turnout before his court.
What will you make of so many thousands, of such a multitude of men and women, persons of every sex and every age and every rank, when they present themselves before you. How many fires, how many swords will be required? What will be the anguish of Carthage itself, which you will have to decimate?
That's not a shrinking violet. It's not the voice of someone whose religion is the opiate of the people, dulling him to the social realities of his day. At the front of the letter, Tertullian as good as tells Scapula that he loves him in Christ's name, but by the end of the letter, we learn that Christians were still willing to make a public stand for their faith, even if it cost their lives. Christians believed themselves to be the victors. They believed that true power to change the world lay not in politics, not in the judiciary or the military, but in the message of Christ's death and resurrection. They really believed it. And they saw Christ's own story of suffering and glory as the proof and pledge that they too were destined for glory, no matter how much suffering they experienced. This is what made Christians good, even cheerful losers. The thought that they had already won. Their role was simply to remain true to the way of Christ, seeking to transform the world through just 4 things: prayer, service, persuasion, and suffering. Prayer for the world that it might know the love of God. Service of all, regardless of belief or class. Persuasion about the Christian faith. And suffering with good grace, knowing that death is followed by resurrection. You can press play now. If you like what we're doing, there are a bunch of things you can do to really help us out. You can go to Apple Podcasts and give us a review. Or you can go to undeceptions.com and pick up one of our t-shirts from the store. You can become an Undeceptions Plus subscriber and get access to a bunch of extras and our special Facebook group. And if you really want to help our team, please consider making a donation. Go to undeceptions.com, click the oversized yellow donate button and see where the wind blows. While you're there, send us a question by audio or text and I'll try and answer it in the upcoming Q&A episode. See ya. Undeceptions is hosted by me, John Dickson, produced by Kaley Payne, and directed by Mark John Luther Hadley. Alasdair Belling is a writer and researcher. Siobhan McGuiness is our online librarian. Lyndie Leviston remains my wonderful assistant. Santino Dimarco is Chief Finance and Operations Consultant. Editing by Richard Humwey. Our voice actor today was Yannick Laurie. Special thanks to our series sponsor Zondervan for making this Undeception possible. Undeceptions is the flagship podcast of undeceptions.com, letting the truth out. An Undeceptions podcast.